Hello, friends. This is Mike Williams of the Sage Aquay Radio Hour. I recently had the pleasure of joining my friend Mark Devlin on Cara St. Louis's Hard True podcast. This is the first hour of a 2-hour show. In this hour, we discuss how the music industry is fabricated with the ultimate objective of engineering society. In hour 2, which can be listened to on Cara's Patreon site, we discuss the conspiracy around the replacement of Paul McCartney back in 1966. The link is in the description box below. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody. This is Cara St. Louis, and welcome to the third edition of the Patron Series Lectures. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad I'm here. And frankly, I'm thrilled to get these two in the studio. Mike Williams is perhaps my oldest friend in the alternative community. I love the guy to pieces. He has Sage Aquay Radio Hour and blog and some other stuff attached to that in the United States. He'll correct me if I don't say it in a way that makes it easy for you to find. Okay, I'm so used to going there, I don't think about it anymore. I want you to be able to find it, though. And honestly, Mike is also a guitar aficionado. It's true. He makes them, he repairs them, he buys them, he talks about them, he loves them. And he has a blog that's strictly about guitars, and I couldn't find the link today, Mike. Can you just say it?
It's actually my YouTube channel. So if you go to, it's another YouTube channel. So if you go to Mike Williams, Do It Yourself, Guitars, that's where you'll find me. Yep.
Yes. I sometimes can't help myself poking fun a little bit at him because he is such a guitar maniac. But you can tell he loves it. It is his passion. And frankly, my youngest son is a guitar freak, and he's following Mike now too, but on a different level. All right, so there's Mike Williams, and I also have Mark Devlin, who has become a really good friend to me. He lives here in England. He is a DJ of not small renown. He is a big deal DJ over here. Is your show called the Sound of Now? Is that your DJ show?
Yeah, that's my proper radio
Your
show.
Proper radio show.
Conspiracy madness. That's my real radio show, The Sound of Now, which goes out on an FM radio station in Oxford every Saturday evening.
Yeah, fantastic. He's also he lectures worldwide. I'm going to say worldwide. He lectures worldwide on his special subject, which is, in fact, the massive music con that has taken over the 20th century. And I've said to both these guys so often, I'm so glad that you guys are handling this huge Leviathan sort of empire state building of a component of the social engineering of the 20th century. Because it's really, really, really important, and it's been devastating. And they have dug in so deep and so far. But Mark has several books out. I want to talk about Musical Truth, because that's the current book. And that's the book that he tours with right now. And he's got one in the hopper that's about ready to come out. And I know he's going to share some of that with us. He shared a tidbit before we got started, and I'm very excited to hear. But the other books are what, Mark? You have a couple others too, don't you?
Well, I've got one that I put out about 10 years ago called Tales from the Flip Side. And that was when I was in a very different place consciously. It was before I woke up to any of these great truths. And that's reflected in the book. It was just a collection of DJ anecdotes, funny stories from the sharp end of the DJ game. So,
Right.
if people like my overall writing style, they might enjoy the odd story from that, but you're not going to get any world-changing revelations from that particular book.
And sometimes that's good too. I mean, it's also good to know the people that we're interacting with and other levels. It gives us a sense of who they are. Now, Mark, I have to do this. I have to do it. Apparently, Mark Devlin is dead. Mark Devlin is dead, and this is probably Fark. Are you Fark? Who
Well,
are you, and what
I've been
have you
called
done?
all kinds of things, Cara.
Who
And
are
often with
you, and
four
what have you
letters.
done with
So
the real
who
Mark
can say?
Devlin? I made this discovery yesterday, gang, when I was looking at Mark online. He's dead. Can you
Well,
explain yourself?
it helps my credibility as a Paul is dead researcher to have this myth that I was actually replaced myself. I feel it helps the information to get across in a more meaningful way.
Did he tell you about that, Mike?
No, I had no idea
Yeah,
that
he's
Mark was
listening.
dead.
He reported as dead online.
Neither
He
did
is.
I, as it goes.
I showed him. He said, "What?" I said, "Look, you're dead. They say you're dead. They say you died. Here's your books. Says you died."
I should have faked it years ago.
So this is Fark. How much plastic surgery did they do? Come on.
Well, that would be telling.
Okay, I'm
Coin a
kidding.
phrase from the famous TV show, The Prisoner.
Okay, listen. I'm teasing him. I just couldn't help it. You can imagine. Okay, so also before we get started, I'm going to take a minute and mention someone that Mike and I know well, who has passed across the threshold in the last few days. Her name was Pamela Tartar, and she was on what was her station? Mike, I can't remember off the top of my
Pure
head.
Momentum Network.
Pure Momentum Network. We were both interviewed by her more than once. Mike interviewed her. I know Mike was a really good friend, and I have to say something about her because I'm getting like a lump in my throat right now. I have to say something about her because no one, unless you knew Pamela, you have no idea the physical challenges that woman fought through to bring things to public attention. She was magical. She was a healer, and yet she could barely, she was so ill for so long. So I, for one, am glad that she's got some peace and some release and that she's over on the other side watching us. But I do want to say thank you. Well done, my friend. Well done, Pamela Tartar. Well done, because you offered so many of us solace and help and love during most of your end of your life when you could barely, it was an effort to draw a breath. Anyway, so this show is dedicated to Pamela. And Mike's got some of the shows that he did with her up on his website. So please have a look. Please have a look. Okay. So we're going to talk about MusicCon. Okay. All three of us here have done work and are deeply interested in and concerned about the social engineering of the 20th century because it's how they've managed to get us to do and be who we are and what we're doing and accept the terrible, terrible things that are happening to us. It is the terraforming, the social forming of the world that we're supposedly leaving our children. I'm going down swinging. I know Mark is, and I know Mike is. So here we are to talk about the MusicCon. So I guess the first thing to do would be to give it a bit of a general background, because let's assume, as we should, that not everybody knows, the beginnings of this kind of thing and how it played out in general. So who wants to start that one off?
Mark, why don't you take it, because you have your book. It's you're very well equipped to discuss it.
Okay, so the whole subject area of culture creation, social engineering, and lifetime actors and the way they get used is going to be a big part of the upcoming book. And it's the major subject area that I've been looking at for the last couple of years, really trying to get an understanding of how these whole things get done. And the more I've looked into it, the more I've come to realize that the corporate music industry on both sides of the Atlantic, because you see so many connections between the American industry and the British industry. And it'll be the case in other countries as well, but it's mainly the American and British industries. It would seem to be the case that these corporate music games were set up specifically for the purpose of brainwashing and mind controlling and sowing certain ideas and values and belief systems in the minds of the general public. Because when I started looking at the timeline of all these things, I found myself going ever further back. So I started off getting drawn into this whole area of research by looking at recent pop music videos from the last 10 or 15 years or so. And I was seeing all the same symbolism cropping up: occult symbology, hand signals, all the calling cards of the elite ruling class and the occultists that preside over these industries. Then I found myself going back to the 1980s and seeing the same symbols cropping up in pop videos from the prominent artists of that era. Then I found myself being drawn back to the 70s, to the 60s, and then all the way back to the 1950s, and pretty much the instigation of these industries. So you could take it back to the rock and roll era, I guess, Bill Haley and the Comets' Rock Around the Clock onwards, and Elvis Presley and the emergence of all those artists. And it certainly seems to be the case that the fingerprints of the military intelligence communities and social engineering think tanks like the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School and Stanford Research Institute and all these different organizations were there right from the start. And you see all these connections between these prominent artists and the CIA and MI6 and the other intel agencies. It's very apt that we're recording this interview today because it turns out to be the 40th anniversary of the reported death of Elvis Presley. And I say reported death because whenever it comes to these apparent celebrity demises, there are always more questions than answers and a whole load of anomalies and discrepancies, which, to a suspicious-minded researcher like myself, casts some doubt on the official story. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Elvis Presley definitely died on the 16th of August 1977, but the official version of events is that he did. And when you look at Elvis, you find that his manager for, the vast part of his career was Colonel Tom Parker, who has connections back into the world of the military. Elvis himself was, of course, drafted into military service. There's a very strong suggestion that he was working for various intelligence agencies, such as the DEA, and doing some undercover work for the CIA. So that's the very first kind of superstar of the rock and roll era. And straight away, you've got all these dubious connections when you do some delving into his background. Then you could take it forward to the next massive act that really had a major impact, which would be the Beatles. Started off in the UK, then we had the British invasion, and there's probably a bit more to that particular phrase than at first meets the eye, when the Beatles and all these other British groups started to become very popular in the US. And you do some delving into the background of all these groups, and you find the fingerprints of the intelligence services such as MI6 and, again, the Tavistock Institute and all these different organizations all over them. It's the same with the Rolling Stones. It's the same with The Who. Then you can get into the American bands like The Doors and the Grateful Dead, and there's definite connections there going into the CIA. And you just come to realize that it seems to be the case that the industry was set up by these organizations, and these bands and these artists were put out there as their chosen ones, as their assets, specifically to have a social engineering effect on the general public, on the people that would lap all these people up. And it's the creation of heroes and icons and rock gods. That's what we've got through these celebrities. Whether it's somebody like Jim Morrison, who was seen as an anti-war icon and a real prominent figure of that whole counterculture scene, or whether it's somebody like the Beatles that had this hysterical, obsessive mass following among so many people, or whether it's somebody today like Jay-Z, Kanye West, Beyonce, Rihanna. These people are put on pedestals. They're revered as iconic heroes and cultural figures that have a major influence on society. And whenever anyone gets to that level of influence, you've got to ask yourself what the agenda is, because there's always an agenda to be uncovered if you know where to look and if you look deep enough.
So there's a couple of things that come up. Mike, I'll ask you to chime in on this next couple of things, because I've heard you talk about at least one of these. I know about Theodore Adorno. Yeah. He's sort of that's the name that you get sort of at the pinnacle of the music, the beginning, the inception of this music con, this great music con. So we should say some things about him. He's straight out of the Frankfurt School, but then at a certain point, it's really hard to distinguish between one and the other. And I also wonder about these folks, these people, when they get on the rise, when they're on the rise and when they're on top, or do they enjoy it, or are they so MK Ultra that they have absolutely no idea where they are anyway? Do you know what I mean? Because somebody said, and I tend to agree that it's the case, the secret space program actually has to do with MK Ultra. It's those spaces they make in your psyche that they fill with other things. That's actually the secret space program. Anyway, Mike, can you catch some of that?
Yeah, so I'll start with whether all of these folks are in the club or whether they're brought in as part of the social engineering scheme. So you have those players that are in the music industry, they are in the secret societies, they're in the club. So when we talk about, as an example, the guy that's playing Paul McCartney, I know we're going to get into that into the second hour, but his name, purportedly, based upon the memoirs of Billy Shears, is William Shepard, Bill Shepard. And I'm picking on him because he is definitely in the club. He's a high-ranking Freemason. And we can say this about many of the players that are in the major bands. So they are there. They are selected to lead the parade, if you will. And then we have other players, bands that want to they want to become popular. They want to have fame and fortune. They want to be a rock band. They want to be a pop music band. They're not necessarily in the club to begin with. But what happens is they are selected and picked, whatever that selection process is, they're honed in on. And they are then used as part of the social engineering scheme that they have in place. So as an example, a lot of these pop stars we have today, yet some of them are clearly, like I said, they're in the club, they have their membership card. But a lot of these young gals, as an example, I don't tend to believe that they are brought in because they're part of the secret society. They're brought in and they are exploited. And part of that exploitation means that they go through the whole process, the ritual process, the occult process of being indoctrinated into the system.
Right.
And you can see where some of these musicians and these artists have actually broken down, where the programming and what they have been subjected to became too much for them. I mean, one of the ones we can go back to was Britney Spears. I mean, she had a complete breakdown. We see Katy Perry having a breakdown. This is because they can't keep up with what it is that has been plowed into their heads. You see?
Right.
So they started off as musicians or artists with all good intentions, just wanting to be famous, get their music out there, sing. But the problem is that the industry is very, very dark.
Yeah.
It's dark and it's controlled, like Mark was just saying. And there's no getting out from under it. If you're going to seek and then achieve fame and fortune in the music industry and even the entertainment business today, there's a price to pay, and that price to pay is selling your soul to the devil.
Right.
Now, Theodore Adorno, just quickly, there are researchers in the Paul is Dead community that claim that Theodore Adorno actually wrote the Beatles' music.
I have heard that, yeah.
Right, and it was handed off to the Beatles to perform. Now, there's no way of validating that. I know of no real substantive information or evidence or facts that I've come across to be able to substantiate that. But I do throw this out there. I remember when I was listening to the Beatles, going back into the very early years when we talk about especially 65 and 66, when we had Rubber Soul and we had the Revolver album, which were extraordinary albums. And then you had songs like For No One, which was written by biological Paul McCartney. And sometimes you have to think to yourself, at least I did, I would pause, Cara, and I would think, how did a 23 or 24-year-old guy have the worldly experience, right? The experience in life to be able to pen those words, number one, the lyrics, and then the music itself. So I don't know.
Example. It's a good song to pick out as an example, really.
Because it's a song that talks about, it's very complex with regard to relationships.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, well, I think back to when I was 23 and 24, I had relationships, but would I be able to sit down and pen such a magnificent song like that? So I don't know. I'm just putting that out there, Cara, as food for thought. I don't know whether Theodore Adorno was writing their music or not. I tend to lean toward no, from the standpoint of I think maybe the Beatles in the early days got some help to do these things.
Yeah.
But as time went on, I think that they were they came into their own and they were writing their own music. But again, I really don't know. So it's conjecture on my part.
Right. Well, we're taking it all apart based on what we know in general and sometimes specifically about the social engineering push in this country, which in the 20th century was just, in this country, in the United States. Sorry, Mark. Mark and I are sitting in England and I'm still thinking, but in the United States, it was absolutely brutal starting in the 60s for sure. You had Mark Hughes, you had Theodore Adorno. It was all out in California. I know Mark's recently been to Laurel Canyon, haven't you? What did you learn out there, Mark?
Well, I wanted to follow in the footsteps of everything that I'd read in the book by Dave McGowan, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which really opened so many people's eyes to the true nature of the counterculture, psychedelic folk rock music scene of the mid to late 1960s. And McGowan showed that although most of the historical emphasis has been on San Francisco, and specifically the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, in terms of where the hippie movement got started, so many of the prominent musicians of that era actually came out of Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. And his question was, why should this be? This was a neighborhood which, prior to that age, had absolutely no musical heritage whatsoever. And yet it was drawing all these musicians in from all over the United States and overseas to this one particular neighborhood in LA. And so I went up there in April with Greg Carlwood of the Higher Side Chats podcast. He wanted to come along for the road trip as well. And we went to a whole load of these iconic hangout spots that all these musicians would congregate in, such as Frank Zappa's old log cabin home, Jim Morrison's old house. We also went up to Cielo Drive, the site of the Tate murders at the hands of the Manson family. And we went to the hotel where Janis Joplin was discovered dead, and all kinds of grisly places like that. It was a bit of a Hollywood death tour, really. But I just wanted to see what this place was all about and get an understanding of what went on in those heady days in the mid to late 1960s. And I did a podcast just recently with Jan Irvin of Gnostic Media and Steve Altrim, revisiting the whole Summer of Love counterculture 60s scene, because we're on 50 years now, the 50th anniversary of that 1967 psychedelic zenith of that whole thing. And it really is a masterclass in how social engineering gets done. And we're just starting to understand it properly, I feel now, all these decades later. All these musicians were put up there as these cultural heroes, as these leaders of this movement that was supposed to be going on, this change in culture, this change in social attitudes. But because of the research opportunities now afforded to us by the internet, we're able to understand where most, if not all, of these key players came from. And once again, it's connections going all the way back into the CIA and the Pentagon and Harvard and Yale and Skull and Bones and Bohemian Grove and all these secret societies. And you come to understand all these prominent figures were placed there to have an effect on culture and to steer it in a certain direction. And it would appear in those days to have been all about the debasement and the degradation of morals and changing people's belief systems and changing what was socially acceptable to people versus what previously wasn't. And we're really feeling the after effect ripples of that era now, I would suggest 50 years later, in terms of attitudes to drugs, to sex, to familial relationships, to sexual relationships. You know, all of that was changed in that counterculture era. There was LSD everywhere. There were other kinds of drugs everywhere. The whole scene was just awash in it. And it was all being provided by the CIA.
Right.
And that stands as the best example, I would suggest, of how cultural creation gets done. But there are many, many others. And what we have in these times is the same kind of templates, the same kind of plans being rolled out, but the details are just different, and it's being packaged for a new generation. So right now we've got this whole transgender agenda, this whole LGBT thing, the whole normalization of gender fluidity and gender neutrality and all this stuff. You know, people get very upset about it, and it obviously pushes people's buttons when you start raising these issues. And you always have to substantiate it by saying, well, I do, by saying I don't have a problem with anybody's lifestyle choice or anybody's sexual orientation, so long as it's their business and they don't inflict it on others and it causes no harm towards others. But when you see all the stuff that we're getting now in terms of the normalization of transgenderism, it goes way beyond any kind of natural, organic thing that is just coming from people going about their daily business. It has the fingerprints of social engineers all over it. It's coming from these agencies, and it's deliberately to change culture. And that's why it's always done, to change the direction that culture is going in and to change the attitudes of the general public and to do it all beneath the radar so that people don't realize that it's going on. But now, thanks to the many researchers there are out there, we're starting to understand how all this stuff gets done.
Mm-hmm. Well, Two things, really. I was thinking while you were speaking was that there really has never been a better, sharper edged sword to drive between parents and children than this music industry over the last 50 years. And that's been one of the driving forces of the Frankfurt School to break up the family. Yeah. And then the other thing, of course, that one thinks of, at least what I think of, is the child abuse that's going on right now. And within the context of what may be the transgender phenomenon, you think about Angelina Jolie starting her young daughter Shiloh on male hormones to help her toward his himness, toward his maleness. The child is 11 years old. I'm sorry, there's no excuse for that. The child is 11 years old. Okay. So these are the sorts of things that that we really need to talk about. We really need to have a look at. And that one in particular, the gender fluidity is difficult. I know lots and lots of people whose children are occupying that space, and it's a minefield for them because they love their children and they don't, you know what I mean? They love their children. They certainly don't want to be estranged from their children because they don't, anyway, you know what I mean. So
let me just throw another one in there, if I may.
Yeah.
Which is, just recently we had Russell Brand coming out after a period absent from the media. I mean, anyone that still falls for Russell Brand's revolutionary Man of the People act, I really don't know what to tell you. You're probably watching the wrong show if you fall for that and you're looking at this. Yeah. But Russell Brand has been utilized in so many different ways over the years for various agendas. And there have been so many red flags to let anyone with a modicum of attention about them understand what he's all about. But I think it was just last year he came out and announced that his wife or his girlfriend, whatever it was expecting their first child. And he announced in the media that he was going to raise his child gender fluid. Yeah. Then just recently, earlier this year, we had a grime artist by the name of Skepta. So grime is a form of UK rap music. It's very aggressive, very fast-paced. It's packaged towards young people. It's very much a London kind of sound. But the MCs that have come out of this scene have traditionally been very macho and very kind of full-on and edgy and aggressive. So you got this guy Skepta, and he appears at this awards do, and he's being interviewed. And the interviewer says, "What is it you're rocking? What are you wearing, Skepta?" And he's got this kind of tight-up knitwear on. And he says, "Oh, this is actually women's clothing." He said, I'm gender fluid now. I'm wearing women's knitwear." Now, 10 years ago, if a rapper or a grime artist had come out and said, "Yeah, I'm wearing women's knitwear," there would have been laughed off the scene at the very least.
There would have been violence,
never have been
probably.
Seriously again, and their career would have been over. But because of the way this whole thing has been made socially acceptable, and because of the crime that it now is to question it or criticize it or have anything to say about it other than the official narrative, it's completely accepted. And nobody's getting upset about this. And that's a great example of the slow drip effect of normalizing something through social engineering, where 10 years ago it was unacceptable. Now nobody feels that they can safely talk about it and they just accept it because it's the done thing. I just wanted to throw that in there as an example.
No, that's fine. I think, and I'm going to say something that's a big non sequitur, and then we can go back to this. But I remember Jonathan Pye. You know who I mean, don't you, Mark? He's a comedian over here. You've seen his stuff. Jonathan Pye. Pye. P-I-E. No, oh, God. Okay, I'm going to send you a link then. He did this commentary 6-7 minutes after the day after Trump was elected. And I couldn't have agreed more with it in the sense that you shut people down, you shut people up, you don't let them say what they think, you completely end the discussion, you completely end the debate, and this is what you get. This is what you get. People go into the voting booths and that's the only place they can say how they feel, So, I mean, it's the PC stuff. It's the PC stuff that, that's been very, very effective in shutting everybody up, As long as you're saying you can't say that, then you have problems. Political correctness, by the way, came out of the anthropology. Franz Boas and Margaret Mead were the first ones who sort of started collecting up that bit for us. But I digress because we're here to talk about music. Anyway,
Yeah,
Mike.
and if you don't like it, you're an anti-Semitic, homophobic conspiracy theorist. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to, for a second, just to go back to Laurel Canyon, Cara and Mark, for a moment, because maybe some of the audience is not familiar with some of the bands that came out of Laurel Canyon. So I'll just name a few of them so you can put it into context and you can understand what was coming out of Laurel Canyon from a music perspective. So we had bands like the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Monkees, Beach Boys, the Mamas and the Papas, the Turtles, the Eagles, Frank Zappa, Steppenwolf, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Three Dog Night, Alice Cooper, The Doors, of course, with Jim Morrison. We mentioned that. Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins, James Taylor, Carole King, Jackson Brown. Okay, so this was not just, a couple of names. There were a lot of artists that came out of Laurel Canyon. And the other interesting thing to note about Laurel Canyon, which is just a suburb in California, is that there was a top secret facility there, government facility called Lookout Mountain, which was a full service film studio and recording studio. So they did not have to go outside of Lookout Mountain in order to do whatever films they were doing or whatever recordings they were doing. And until this day, it's not clear exactly what all was going on there, but Lookout Mountain was right smack in the middle of Laurel Canyon and the scene back in the 1960s.
No. Gosh, it was like you just rattled off a history of my childhood there.
Oh, mine too. Yeah.
With those bands, Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's
Oh, and by the way, Charles Manson was part of the scene also.
Yeah, and he's getting out of jail soon, isn't he?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know what's going on with that. Anyway, again, I digress. I don't want to digress. We have too much to talk about, right? So the other thing, I've got to move us a little bit along because the second hour is going to be about this Paul McCartney stuff. And having listened to some of the research these guys have been doing, that is a huge hour. Okay, that's a huge hour. So I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, I want to talk about, if we can, just briefly, I know that these guys have said that they've just barely started to break the surface on some of these things, but there have been some really odd deaths in the music industry lately. We might be speculating. We might. I don't happen to think there's anything wrong with speculating as long as you say, I'm speculating here, but here's what I think might be going. Anyway, it's up to them whether they feel comfortable doing stuff like that. And I also think that works its way into some of the subject matter that apparently is in Mr. Devlin's next book, which could be pretty interesting. So who wants to start that one? Because I'm so not hip.
Well, Mike, I think you've got a little more on Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington than me, so maybe you want to kick off with that, and I've got some other stuff to add afterwards.
Yeah, I'll just get into a little bit about the numbers. I haven't really dug in deep yet. I started this about a week ago, and I was going through a list of famous musicians and artists that passed away over the last 2 or 3 years or so, and I was taking a look at birth dates and dates that they died, and I'm looking for patterns of numbers. Because when we talk about numbers and we talk about the secret societies and the Freemasons and the Illuminati, there are certain numbers which are very, very popular. The numbers 3, 6, 11, 7, 8, and so on, 66, 33. So if we take a look at Chester Bennington and also Chris Cornell, first of all, Chris Cornell was born on July 20th, 1964, and Chester Bennington died on July 20th, 2017. So, what do you make of that? I don't know. It's kind of an odd coincidence if you ask me. But when I take a look at their birth dates and the dates of their death, the numbers 6 and 11 are just revolving around both those guys, along with another artist like Greg Allman. When Greg Allman died on July 21st of this year, again, the numbers 6 and 11 are associated with his birth date and a date that he died. We go back to David Bowie, who died on January 10th of 2016. We have the number 11 very prominent with Bowie. So, I mean, we can go through all this. So the same thing with John Lennon, the number 11. George Harrison is the number 6 or 66. Paul McCartney is 33 and 666. So it starts to make you question what's going on here. Now, Mark started the show by saying these artists die, or we're led to believe that they die. Maybe they do, but perhaps they don't. I mean, I don't know, to be honest with you. Obviously, people do have to die. But how much of this is what they refer to as hexcraft? So hexcraft means that it's magic. So when they do their magic, when I say they, I'm talking about the secret societies and the Freemasons. It's magic in the sense of like Aleister Crowley magic. The numbers 6, 66, 666, those are numbers that are used as spiritual magic to be performed as a form of charming or enchantment. So, it starts to get really interesting when you start to take a look at these artists and you start to take a look at the numbers. And then when you try to dig in and understand what these numbers mean from an esoteric perspective, it really, really makes you start to wonder what in the world is going on here. So, to me, what's going on, Cara and Mark, is that this is all part of the of what's playing out here from a social engineering perspective. But in order to social engineer, they are engaged in the occult. They're engaged in their rituals and they're engaged in their magic. And this is how they're doing it. Now, some people have a hard time with this. They just believe it's a bunch of nonsense to talk about magic and rituals and stuff like that. But it doesn't really even matter if the person that you're talking to believes it or not. They believe it, and they're doing it, and they're using it. So I'll just leave it there with that. I have more work to do on a lot of the names that are here. I have names like, I have Prince also. Prince has the number 6 associated with him. Leon Russell, George Michael. George Michael has the number 6 associated with him too, with regard to his date of death. So it just goes on and on and on. But so there's definitely something there as far as I'm concerned. But personally, I've got to do a little more work to kind of pull it together.
Before we move on to Mark, though, I want to just throw out there, because this is really interesting, and it, again, probably just speculation. I don't know. But one of these fellows who just died has been hooked up with the Podesta brothers in some strange way. You know who I mean, Mark.
Well, this is Chester Bennington, and there's a lot of researchers that have drawn attention to the uncanny similarity facially between Chester Bennington and John Podesta.
Yeah.
And John Podesta, as people are probably aware, was caught up in this whole Pizzagate mess when that broke around about November at the time of the US election. This suggestion of a paedophile child trafficking sex ring coming out of Washington, D.C. And the Podesta brothers, John and Tony Podesta, were heavily implicated in that, according to what researchers had uncovered. And so now we have the untimely death of this musician, and a lot of researchers are suggesting that he was actually the illegitimate son of John Podesta, and that his death was in some way connected to Chester Bennington seeking to uncover and expose this disgusting sex ring that exists coming out of Washington and many other places. And I've got to say, when you look at the photographs of the two of them together, there certainly does seem to be a family resemblance. How you would ever substantiate that, I don't know, because there's nothing by way of documentary proof that can lead you to conclude that that is the case. So to a very large extent, it has to be conjecture and speculation, but a number of researchers think there could be something in it. Another interesting element to throw into the mix is that Chris Cornell, one of the recent rock music deaths that we're talking about from Soundgarden and Audioslave, was the godfather to one of Bennington's kids. So there's another link between the two of them there.
Right.
And in both cases, there are lots of unanswered questions and anomalies, such as the girlfriends of both these artists have said that there's no way they would have committed suicide. It wasn't in their nature. They were very happy leading up to that time. So you're left with all these mysteries to solve.
Right, right. So, talk about your new book, though. What do you want to tell us about your new book that plays into all this? Because I'm sure it does.
Well, I've not had time to do a lot of research into Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington. I do intend to mention it in the new book, which will necessitate me delving into the whole story much more than I have so far. But one recent artist demise that I am going into great detail on is the reported death of George Michael, which we got on Christmas Day 2016. So I've made the point that most of the time on British TV, as you may be aware, Cara, if you actually watch it,
I don't.
on Christmas. Good for you. But on Christmas Day, there's not a lot of news around. We usually just get a regurgitation of the Queen's Christmas speech and whatever she said, and a few sound bites from that. So
Yeah.
the British public was absolutely shocked to the core on Christmas Day evening, 2016, when the news broke that George Michael, famous 80s pop singer from Wham, had been found dead at his home of apparent heart failure. There were all kinds of things that people were seizing on straight away with regard to this. Most notably, George Michael's most famous song, arguably, was Last Christmas. And in it, he's got the line, Last Christmas, I gave you my heart. And so we have this artist who turns up dead on Christmas Day of apparent heart failure. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And when you get into the element of predictive programming, you find some very interesting stuff indeed. And if people aren't familiar with predictive programming, this is the act of placing aspects of a real world event which is yet to happen into works of popular culture. So it can be music videos, it can be TV shows, Hollywood movies, live stage shows like the Grammys, the Super Bowl, whatever. And it tends to hint at something which is coming. So then when the event actually happens, a lot of people go back to these earlier works of popular culture and they can see all these strange examples that seem to foreshadow this event. With George Michael, it's just ridiculous in terms of the amount of stuff that we have. So first of all, the two main British soap operas, both of which were screened on Christmas Day, are EastEnders and Coronation Street. And there was a reference in both of those to George Michael on Christmas Day, a very short while before the news of his death was announced. So in EastEnders, you got this thing where they're having this get-together in the pub, and they've got some Christmas crackers, and they all pull the Christmas crackers, and the big joke is that the gag inside the Christmas cracker is the same for all of them, and it makes a reference to George Michael and Last Christmas. Then over on ITV on Coronation Street, which aired just before the news bulletin, you got a choir that are doing an a cappella version of Last Christmas. Then when it comes to movies that were released in 2016, you've got so many that make a reference to George Michael dying. Let me just consult a couple here. So you've got this movie called Deadpool, and it has a storyline which involves bets as to which famous people are going to be the next to die. And the main character in the film is portrayed as a super fan of Wham. And George Michael's Careless Whisper plays over the film's closing credits. You got the musical La La Land, which was released over Christmas 2016. And there's a scene there where the female lead character yells out George Michael's name for no apparent reason. You got a movie called Keanu, also released in 2016. And you got these characters who are basically street kind of gangsters. But the big joke is that one of them is a super fan of George Michael, of all people. And there's this one scene where he takes a hit from some kind of crack pipe or a bong or something, and he goes into this alternate reality. He's going into this altered state of consciousness, and he appears to go to heaven, and he sees this ghostly apparition of George Michael from his Faith video, and he kind of communicates with him. Isn't that weird? Also, Wham's music plays over the closing credits of that film, just as a further coincidence. Somebody brought my attention to the fact that a short while earlier in 2013, there was a British drama called Having You, and there's a scene in a public toilet where a couple of characters go in, and this one guy says to the other one, he makes some comment about the ghost of George Michael. He says, careful, you'll be meeting ghosts of George Michael in here. And the other character says, oh, George Michael isn't dead. And he goes, isn't he? I could have sworn he was. Then you've got T2 Train Spotting, which also came out in 2016. And there's a whole monologue that Ewan McGregor goes into based around the Choose Life slogan of Wham and George Michael back in the 80s.
Right.
Footage of George Michael that gets spliced into that. There are a couple of other films where George Michael's music was used in the closing credits. One of them is Zoolander. the Martin Scorsese movie Bleed for This. So all these movies, and so many of them came out in 2016, the year of George Michael's reported death, which have references to him, and many of them have references to him having died. This goes way beyond the realms of coincidence. And what we're dealing with here is some kind of sorcery, some kind of magic with a K, because as Mike said, what we have presiding over the music industry and the entertainment industry generally is an elite priest class of dark occult practitioners who have their religious rituals and their ways of doing things that are very important to them. It's often to do with the numbers. It's often to do with symbolism. It's all to do with the dark occult. And they run these rituals on the general public right in front of our eyes through these works of popular culture. Most people have absolutely no idea what is going on, but they are making, nevertheless, an energetic connection with all this stuff on an unseen level.
Yeah, because we are, first and foremost, we are magicians, all of us. Yes, and we are surrounded by magic all the time. And we have simply been made to forget that it exists, what it looks like, and half the time, no, more than half the time, we're being put in a position where we're enacting the magic for them. Yeah, we're doing the job for them a lot of the time. This is where we really have to focus our energy in making people understand what it is that's actually going on. For example, just not in terms of music. Let's talk about our vocabulary. Let's talk about being dumbed down such that we're using about 20% of the words in English that are available to us. I think one of the reasons that's the case is because then they've corralled us into a position where we're just constantly casting spells for them because we have a limited amount of words that we're using. Do you know what I mean? And we're using them in such a way because of the social engineering that you're talking about right now that we're doing a lot of their work for them, right? So unfortunately, I have to move us to the second hour. But I have to say, I'm so impressed with the research that you guys are doing along these lines. I am so glad that you're here. And also, before we end the first hour, I have to do something extraordinarily self-serving and plug the lecture that Mark and I are doing together soon with Tony Sayer. Yes, so we're going to do it on Guy Fawkes night or day, right? That's November the 5th in London. Mark's going to be talking about what Mark talks about. This is just a taster. Okay, he really gets going. Tony's going to talk about the social engineering, Tony Sayer's flavor, and I'm going to talk about the imagination, and the seed race of the Fae. I have to plug that because I'm really excited about it. Okay, so guys, thank you very much for the first hour. I'll meet you in the second hour, and thanks everybody for being here for this part, and we will see